It was the smile that saved her. Not the type of smile that reached the eyes, those were reserved for the dead or maybe the Lord, but the flat, steady, compliant curve of the mouth that suggested total, unthinking submission. It was a blank piece of paper upon which white Richmond could write whatever compliance it required. Clara Maywood, at 22 years old, had mastered the art of the innocuous presence. She was the ghost that ironed the judge's shirts, the shadow that scrubbed the sheriff's parlor floors, the silent girl who ensured Mr. Thorne's sheets always smelled faintly of lavender and lye. Her world was white linen and boiling steam, and in that world, the white families of the West End saw only industry and silence. They saw a quiet, dark girl, perpetually smiling, which meant she was grateful, or perhaps just dull-witted. They failed to see the mathematician of grievance, the keeper of debts, building her intricate calculations behind the serenity of her fixed expression. Richmond, Virginia, in 1890, was a city split down the middle by an invisible yet ironclad boundary. Clara lived in Jackson Ward, a place struggling for footing in the shifting sands of Jim Crow, where freedom was theoretical and solvency was a daily battle waged against systemic debt. The men she served lived high on the hills, their Victorian mansions casting long, cool shadows over the thriving but threatened community below. The work was endless. The sheer volume of clothing required by families like the Harlans and the Thornes demanded every hour of daylight. Clara worked at the centralized steam laundry downtown, but she specialized in the delicate finishing work, which required her presence inside the houses themselves, a level of intimacy with the oppressors that few of her neighbors experienced. This proximity was initially a burden, a constant low-level humiliation, but after the incident, the closeness became a key. Her brother, Thomas, was only 19, but he possessed the hands of a master craftsman. Not just muscle, but precision. He could look at a crooked wall and see the physics required to straighten it. He could feel the grain of oak and know where the weakness lay. Thomas wasn't satisfied with the scraps offered to black laborers. He had secured a small, perfect plot of land just outside the expanding industrial zone, controlled by Cyrus Thorne's textile mill. He was building his own shop there, brick by brick, dreaming of the day he wouldn't have to take jobs from white contractors who paid him half the rate they paid a poor Irish immigrant. Thomas, Clara often thought, had forgotten how to be invisible. He was audacious, bright, and tragically visible to the wrong eyes. The trouble started, as it always did, with a lie rooted in desire. Cyrus Thorne, a man whose ambition was as suffocating as the cotton lint floating perpetually around his factory district, wanted Thomas's land. He wanted it cheap, and he wanted it immediately to expand his dye works. Thorne tried the legal route first, offers insultingly low, threats veiled as business advice. Thomas refused every time. He understood the ground beneath his feet was worth more than gold. It was worth independence. "So he's got gumption, that boy," Judge Harlan remarked one afternoon to Sheriff Boone, while Clara quietly swept the Persian rug nearby. Harlan had come to the sheriff's house for an afternoon whiskey, discussing the finer points of maintaining order in the city. "Too much gumption for his own good, eh, Boone?" Sheriff Boone, a man whose gut preceded him into every room and whose eyes were permanently fogged with stale rye, merely grunted, Thorne's fixing to teach him a lesson. Should have taken the offer. Clara didn't flinch. Her smile remained fixed, gentle, as she gathered the dust in a brass pan. "They have already decided his fate," she registered, the conversation filtering not as idle gossip, but as an official decree. The lesson arrived on a Tuesday, stifling hot, the air thick with the smell of coal smoke and impending thunder. Thomas was working on a small cabinet for the widow Reynolds when Boone's deputies arrived, not Boone himself. The charge was ridiculous. Theft of state timber, specifically railroad ties, valued at $75. Everyone in Jackson Ward knew Thomas hadn't stolen a stick in his life, but the charge didn't require truth. It required a jury of Thorne's peers and a judge eager to keep favor with the mill owner. Clara moved immediately, navigating the legal maze that was specifically designed to be impassable. She spent every penny she had, hired the cheapest, shadiest lawyer who specialized in plea bargains, and brought her grandmother's ancient documents showing the clear, deeded ownership of Thomas's land. But the system was a perfectly oiled machine of disenfranchisement. Judge Harlan presided over the initial hearing, his face a mask of weary disapproval. He listened to the testimony for 10 minutes, dismissed the land deeds as irrelevant to the theft charge, and set bail impossibly high. $75 worth of wood, Harlan drawled, wiping the sweat from his neck. A serious matter, Maywood. $300 bail, pending trial. $300 was 2 years' wages for Thomas. It was a life sentence in that stifling brick jail. Clara left the courtroom, her fixed smile now feeling like a mask fused to her skin. She returned to the laundry and worked through the night, calculating how many dresses she would need to clean, how many collars starched, to raise such an impossible sum. By the time the sun rose, painting the Richmond skyline in hazy shades of yellow and smoke, she had exactly $42. It wasn't nearly enough. The lynching happened later that week. It wasn't a public spectacle like some of the horrific accounts she'd heard from deep Mississippi, but a calculated, clinical act of terror. Thomas wasn't killed by a mob. He was taken from his cell late one night, presumably by a small party of men wearing official-looking hats, driven out to the old-growth pine grove near the factory expansion, and executed. The official report, signed by Sheriff Boone, declared it death by unknown persons while resisting arrest. Clara was denied the body until 2 days later. What she saw was not Thomas, the audacious, skilled carpenter, but a brutalized symbol, already stiffening in the heat. It was the moment the scale tipped. The system had not merely failed Thomas, it had actively delivered him to his murderers. The shock did not bring tears or hysteria, only a cold, silent clarity. At the small, quiet funeral in the heat-shimmering cemetery plot, Clara stood apart from the others. The neighbors sang softly, their voices weighted with fear and despair, the common currency of their existence. She watched the dirt being piled back onto the hole that contained her brother, and something deep inside her shifted. The emotional tremor did not register on the surface. Her smile remained unnerving, unwavering. But beneath the fixed expression, the mathematician took over entirely. Debt. The calculation began, silently replacing her pulse. A brother for a plot of land. That is the first measure, the cost of one life paid by 3 men. Clara did not mourn in the conventional sense. Mourning was a weakness, an energy expenditure that could be better used elsewhere. She went back to work the very next day. She needed to be closer than ever to her targets. She needed to understand them the way a surgeon understands the failing organ. Her primary target was Cyrus Thorne, the motivator. Then Judge Harlan, the adjudicator. Finally, Sheriff Boone, the executioner. 3 men, 3 lives, 3 separate accounts of payment required. Clara leveraged the inherent blindness of the privileged. For 3 decades in Richmond, it was understood that the people who served them, the maids, the cooks, the drivers, the laundresses, were not truly people but fixtures, silent appliances that moved through their grand, overheated homes. This perception of invisibility became Clara's most potent weapon. She started with the laundress route. She worked at the steam laundry downtown until noon. Then, carrying large wicker baskets lined with clean white cloth, she made her rounds to the wealthy clientele. She entered back doors, ignored by parlor maids and footmen alike, and went straight to the upstairs bedrooms and drawing rooms. At the Thorne residence, she began spending an hour every Friday ironing Mr. Thorne's dress shirts and his wife's voluminous petticoats right in their master dressing room, ostensibly to ensure the delicate silks didn't wrinkle on the trip back. While the ironing board hissed, Clara wasn't focusing on the cotton. She was listening. She noticed how Mr. Thorne, who ran an empire, left his ledger notes scattered on the mahogany desk. He never worried about her seeing them. She was illiterate, wasn't she? Even if she could read, what good was a factory ledger to a laundress? She was not illiterate. Thomas, in his audacity, had taught her to read, sharing stolen books hidden beneath the floorboards of their small cabin. And she didn't just read the numbers, she read the lies the numbers contained. Thorne's textile business was heavily invested in a risky new dye-patenting scheme that, if the new northern regulations came down as expected, would expose him to catastrophic liabilities. He was leveraged to the hilt. At Judge Harlan's house, Clara learned about his Achilles heel, his son, a prodigal student at the University of Virginia, whose gambling debts were astronomical and whom Harlan was desperately trying to keep hidden from his politically ambitious wife. Clara learned this not by eavesdropping on phone calls, there were few in 1890, but by noticing the consistent placement of envelopes marked private and urgent, hidden behind a specific volume of Blackstone's commentaries in his library. She developed a knack for subtle sleight of hand, quickly scanning the contents while dusting the shelves, her smile placid, utterly disarming. Harlan often walked in on her doing this work, saw her placid face, and dismissed her instantly. "You're a quiet one, Clara," he'd sometimes say, not as a compliment but as a remark on the emptiness of her presence. The sheriff's house was the easiest, yet the most disgusting. Sheriff Boone was vulgar and loud, a man whose domestic life was as slovenly as his professional conduct. His wife, a tired woman perpetually suffering from migraines, left much of the house unsupervised. Boone's weakness was twofold: alcohol and a superstitious terror of anything he couldn't control. He was a man of brute force, yet he believed fervently in omens, curses, and bad luck. When he wasn't shouting at his cook, he was talking about how the air felt wrong in Richmond after the rain. Clara, drawing on the deep, forgotten knowledge passed down from her grandmother, Ma Effie, a woman revered and feared in the Gula community for her knowledge of roots and remedies, knew exactly how to leverage superstition. Ma Effie had taught her about the difference between healing and making things quiet. She knew how to brew teas that settled the stomach and poultices that drew out fever, and she knew how to find the less benevolent roots. The plan began not with violence, but with erosion. She needed to isolate her targets, make them vulnerable, and destroy their credibility before she administered the final, perfect justice. Judge Harlan, the first account on her ledger, needed to fall from grace. He wasn't just a judge, he was a pillar of civic trust. His destruction had to be clean, legal, and self-inflicted. One sweltering afternoon in September, Clara was in the Harlan household, pressing the cuffs of the judge's dinner jacket. She had retrieved the latest letter from his son, a demanding scrawl requesting $2,000 immediately, or he would be expelled. The letter, damning to Harlan's public reputation as an honest family man, was tucked back into the book. Clara knew Harlan had an upcoming meeting with the powerful Senator Vance concerning a political appointment that would secure his financial future. She did nothing explicit. Instead, using a technique Ma Effie called whispers on the steam, she planted tiny, barely audible suggestions. When she spoke to the Harlan's parlor maid, Maggie, a woman deeply indebted to Clara for small favors and kindnesses, she spoke only of Judge Harlan's anxiety. "Poor Judge Harlan," Clara sighed, her fixed smile softening just enough to imply pity. "He's losing so much sleep, worrying about money. I saw him counting silver late last night, Maggie. He looked like a pauper." Maggie, who knew the Harlan family was wealthy beyond measure, was immediately confused. "Money troubles? Nonsense, Clara. I only know what I see, child," Clara murmured, folding a towel with surgical precision. "And he's been so careful with his papers, locking everything away. Even those private letters he keeps hidden. Must be quite serious if he's hiding things from the mistress, no?" The seed was planted. The key to Clara's strategy was diffusion. She never spread the rumor herself. She only established the fact of secrecy and anxiety. Maggie told the cook. The cook told the driver. The driver told the senator's personal valet, who was looking for any juicy detail to relay back to his master. Within 2 weeks, Harlan's desperate attempts to send large sums of money secretly to his son were misinterpreted across Richmond's elite circles. They didn't assume gambling debt. They assumed bribes. Why else would a prominent judge be funneling large, discreet sums through out-of-state intermediaries just before a major political appointment? By the time Harlan met with Senator Vance, the ground beneath him was already dissolving. Vance was polite, overly so, but his eyes were cold. He knew the rumors. He spoke casually about the importance of transparency in public life, the dangers of hidden expenditures. Harlan, desperate and guilty, immediately assumed Vance knew about his son, becoming defensive and erratic. He spent the entire meeting defending his family's honor, unintentionally feeding the precise rumor Clara had engineered, that he was panicked about a financial scandal that could ruin him. The appointment was withdrawn 3 days later, attributed to a vague conflict of interest. Clara learned about the public disgrace while folding tablecloths in the judge's dining room. Mrs. Harlan was weeping hysterically, accusing her husband of incompetence, not infidelity. Harlan sat silently, staring into his whiskey, the picture of a man whose carefully constructed life had imploded. The financial debt to her brother, the first of the three, was close to being paid. Harlan was disgraced, his political career ruined, his reputation in tatters. He was a broken man, stripped of the power he had used to crush Thomas. Clara moved on to Sheriff Boone, the executioner. Boone required a different kind of justice, a deterioration that mirrored his inner rot. Boone's vice, his cheap rye, provided the perfect conduit. Ma Effie's remedies included potent, non-lethal botanicals. Clara prepared a tincture using small amounts of Datura stramonium, or Jimson weed, which grew wild along the riverbanks, known in the old tongue as devil's snare. When mixed in extremely minute, undetectable quantities, it wouldn't kill, but it caused unsettling symptoms: dry mouth, rapid heart rate, intense fragmented hallucinations, and a crushing sense of paranoia. Clara's visits to the Boone house were scheduled for Mondays, the day she collected the heavy, starched duty uniforms. She had observed that Boone kept his rye in a crystal decanter in the study, and that he drank heavily on Sundays to ward off the fear of Monday. It was dangerously intimate work. She had to move fast, without leaving any trace of residue or smell. Her hands, calloused and strong from years of wringing out wet linen, became exquisitely delicate. On her first Monday, she waited until the cook was preoccupied with preparing the midday meal, and Mrs. Boone was laid up with one of her frequent headaches. Clara slipped into the study, the sun slicing through the dusty air. She used a fine, long needle, the kind used for delicate lace repair, to transfer exactly 3 drops of the clear liquid into the nearly full decanter. She left as silently as she arrived, her face fixed in its gentle smile, carrying her basket of soiled uniforms. The symptoms started subtly. Boone began complaining to his deputies that the city felt like it was watching him. He saw shadows shift in the alleyways that weren't there. He started clutching his chest, convinced he was having a heart attack, though the doctor pronounced him perfectly healthy. The rye, his only solace, now delivered not comfort but terror. The situation escalated quickly. Boone became incapable of performing his duties. He started seeing the ghost of Thomas Maywood everywhere, in the jail, in the crowd at the market, leaning against the window in his own study. "He's staring at me, Thorne. I tell you, he's staring right through the glass," Boone shouted one evening, pounding the table at a private dinner hosted by Thorne. Cyrus Thorne, worried about his increasingly unstable accomplice, tried to calm him, but Boone was lost to his own manufactured madness. He was convinced he was being cursed, that the darkies had put a hex on him. He started sleeping with the lights on, refusing to wear his uniform, claiming the heavy blue cloth felt like a shroud. The final straw came during a routine arrest. Boone, attempting to subdue a small older black man accused of vagrancy, suddenly dropped his weapon, fell to his knees, and screamed that the man was covered in snakes. The spectacle was witnessed by a dozen citizens, both black and white. The next day, the mayor demanded his resignation, citing extreme mental instability. Boone was disgraced, institutionalized soon after, removed from the equation. He was alive, yes, but imprisoned by a horror of his own making, far more painful than any swift execution. Clara checked the second account off her ledger. Now only Cyrus Thorne remained. Thorne, the greedy mastermind, was different. He was cold, calculating, and skeptical of superstition. He wouldn't be swayed by rumors or hallucinated curses. Thorne understood money, power, and logistics. His downfall had to be total: economic, psychological, and finally, physical. By early December, Thorne was uneasy. Harlan was ruined. Boone was mad. Thorne told himself it was coincidence, or perhaps the weakness inherent in inferior men, but the string of bad luck was unnerving. His risky dye-patenting investments were collapsing due to new federal oversight, exactly as the ledgers Clara had read suggested they might. He was hemorrhaging cash, and the recent labor unrest at his mill, quietly stirred by rumors of his cruelty, relayed through Clara's network of laundresses and maids, was threatening to halt production. Clara focused her surveillance on Thorne's personal habits. He was an incredibly proud man. He considered himself a self-made titan of Richmond industry. His pride was his true weakness. She began to subtly influence his home environment. When ironing his silk handkerchiefs, she would always ensure that one small spot, easily missed, barely visible, was not quite perfectly pressed, a minuscule flaw in an otherwise pristine uniform. She did the same with the creases in his trousers. If he complained, she apologized with her fixed, gentle smile, immediately correcting the mistake. But the pattern, repeated day after day, week after week, was designed to introduce doubt into a man who required perfect control. If I cannot trust my laundress to press a crease correctly, can I trust my manager to manage the factory? Thorne started shouting at his staff more frequently, convinced he was surrounded by incompetence. He focused obsessively on the small, manageable flaws, losing sight of the catastrophic ones looming on his balance sheets. Clara used her unique knowledge of his schedule to prepare the final stage. Thorne, driven by the collapsing finances, was spending late nights at his office, trying to salvage his patent portfolio. He was tired, isolated, and increasingly desperate. One Tuesday in mid-December, Clara was collecting the weekly wash from the Thorne residence. She paused at the back door, allowing Mrs. Thorne to sign the delivery receipt. "Mr. Thorne is beside himself, Clara," Mrs. Thorne whispered, rubbing her temple. "The mill is having terrible problems. He hasn't slept in days." Clara offered her empty, sympathetic smile. "Terrible, Mum. My thoughts are with him." She walked the few blocks back to Jackson Ward, her mind racing, the calculation reaching its final step. The setting had to be symbolic. It had to be a place Thorne felt entitled to, a place that held the memory of Thomas and the original sin of the theft. She realized the perfect location was the old steam laundry building. It wasn't Thorne's personal property, but it was land he had aggressively acquired years ago, seizing it from her grandmother, Ma Effie, under dubious legal pretenses, only to let it fall into disrepair. It sat abandoned, a crumbling monument to industrial greed, half-mile from his current factory. That evening, Clara penned a single anonymous note on a sheet of cheap, rough paper, the kind Thorne himself used for his mill inventory. Her handwriting was deliberately shaky and unrefined, looking like the desperate scrawl of an underling. The note was placed discreetly on Thorne's desk while he was at dinner. It read simply, "The papers you seek for the patent suit are hidden where the steam used to rise." Midnight. It was the perfect trap. Vague enough to suggest a massive corporate secret, but specific enough to lure a greedy, desperate man. Thorne was convinced that one of his disgruntled employees, knowing the full extent of the patent fraud, was attempting to blackmail him or offer him a lifeline. The steam reference was ambiguous. It could mean the mill boiler room, or it could mean the old laundry. Clara knew where his desperation would take him. The mill was locked tight and guarded. The old laundry, however, was dark, abandoned and easily accessible, a private place where he could meet his informant without witnesses. She spent the following afternoon preparing the site, moving silently through the ruins of the old building. The building was filled with the ghosts of Ma Effie's hard work, the skeletal remains of rusted boilers, and the pervasive smell of mildew and industrial residue. Clara didn't clean, she arranged. She checked the ropes, tested the strength of the old rickety mezzanine platform, and positioned the last remaining industrial lamp, ensuring it cast long, confusing shadows. She wore a simple, dark dress, her face bare, the perpetual smile gone at last. It was replaced by a grim, hard line that suggested every ounce of her remaining humanity was focused on the task at hand. When midnight approached, Clara was waiting on the second floor, concealed in the deep shadows behind the massive, defunct main boiler. The air was cold, damp, and smelled of metallic decay. She heard the carriage pull up outside, the sound muffled by the thick Richmond fog rolling in from the river. A minute later, the heavy door groaned open, and Cyrus Thorne stepped inside. He carried a small lantern that cut weak circles of yellow light through the cavernous space. He looked haggard, his usually impeccable dress coat rumpled, his face slick with sweat despite the cold. He was alone, having dismissed his driver down the road. He didn't want witnesses to his desperate secret dealing. "Hello?" Thorne called out, his voice echoing and cracking. He sounded like a frightened boy, not the textile titan of Richmond. "Who sent the note? I'm here. Show yourself." Clara remained silent, letting the heavy, oppressive quiet of the building work on his nerves. The air itself felt thick with accusation. Thorne moved cautiously, peering around the immense rusting machinery, convinced he was looking for a disgruntled worker, a desperate clerk, someone inferior. He never looked up, never considered that the threat could come from above, from the heights he assumed only he could occupy. "I know you're here," Thorne hissed, holding the lantern higher. "The papers? Tell me where they are, and you'll be compensated. Generously." Clara's voice finally cut through the silence, thin but sharp, carrying across the vast space. It was not the gentle murmur of the laundress. It was cold, clear, and perfectly articulated. "They are right here, Mr. Thorne." Thorne spun around, startled. He lifted the lantern, squinting into the gloom of the mezzanine above. He saw the faint outline of a dark figure standing impossibly still near the railing. "Clara!" he choked out, recognition slow and agonizing. "What in God's name are you doing up there?" He frowned, confused. "You can read." "I can count, Mr. Thorne," Clara replied, her voice steady, "and I can calculate debt." She began to descend the rickety iron stairs, slowly, deliberately, her every movement sounding loud in the silence. Thorne retreated slightly, his bravado giving way to an uneasy fear. The perpetual unsettling smile was back, but now, framed by the darkness and the decay, it looked like a threat. "This is a mistake, girl," Thorne warned, trying to sound authoritative. "You'll be arrested. This is breaking and entering." "You broke and entered long before I did, Mr. Thorne," Clara corrected him, pausing halfway down the stairs. "You stole land from my grandmother. You stole wages from my brother. And then you stole his life." Thorne scoffed, managing a weak laugh. "That vagrant? He tried to steal state property, and he got what was coming to him. Boone handled it. Boone is now raving mad. Judge Harlan is disgraced, and you, Mr. Thorne, are bankrupt. Did you truly believe your actions had no cost? That debt could simply be dismissed because the ledger belonged to someone beneath your notice." Clara took the last step, placing her feet silently on the dusty concrete floor, facing him directly. She stood between him and the door. "I came here for documents," Thorne said, desperation fueling his anger. "I'm leaving now, Clara. You step aside." Clara did not move. She simply tilted her head, and in the low light the full horror of her unchanging smile was revealed. "You won't find the papers, Mr. Thorne. This place," she gestured around the echoing husk of the old laundry, "this is where the account is settled. You needed land for expansion, Mr. Thorne. My brother needed his life for expansion." Thorne finally understood the chilling impossibility of the situation. This was no common thief, no disgruntled employee. This was a reckoning delivered by the very ghost he had sought to ignore for years. He raised the lantern like a shield, peering past her to the dark corners, seeking an accomplice, a gang of vigilantes, someone, anyone, to make sense of the scene. "Where are they?" he demanded, his voice trembling now. "Where are the others?" "There are no others," Clara said simply. "It was just me, just the laundress who smiled." She took one slow step forward. The calculation was complete. The time for erosion was over. Word count approximately 1,690 words. "There are no others," Clara said simply. "It was just me, just the laundress who smiled." Sterling recoiled, not from physical threat, but from the impossible audacity of the claim. His eyes, already bulging, scanned the remnants of the library, the spilled whiskey, the scattered, useless lists of names she had systematically dismantled. He had been tricked by a cipher, a shadow, a mere piece of property that smelled of lie and lavender. "You lie," he choked out, the words sticking in his throat like a dry bone. A woman, a negress, could not possibly understand the structure, the debt instruments, the derivatives. Clara didn't laugh. Laughter would have been too kind, too human. Instead, she took another step, placing her small, calloused hands flat on the mahogany table that still bore the imprint of his frantic search. "It wasn't understanding the derivatives, Master Sterling," she corrected, her voice low, steady, like the deep rhythm of a river that never rushed, only flowed. "It was understanding you. You see a number, you see profit, you see a name, you see collateral. I saw the pattern. I saw where the cash reserves were weak, how Elias's lumber business was leveraged against the new railroad bonds, and how deeply you depended on the spring tobacco shipment to cover the mortgages on the field hands you just purchased from Virginia." She watched the color drain completely from his face. It wasn't the theft of the money that broke him. Men like Sterling could always replenish capital. It was the theft of his system, the realization that the engine of his entire fortune had been meticulously mapped and dismantled by the one person he deemed intellectually incapable of counting past 10. The papers, the letters, he stammered, pointing a trembling finger at the empty cavity of the desk safe, where only dust motes now danced in the evening light. "The critical instruments are already far north," Clara confirmed. "The ones you needed to prove ownership of the Richmond townhouses, the deeds for the 400 acres in Mississippi, the bills of sale for the 60 souls you acquired just last winter. Without those originals, Sterling, you own nothing but the clothes on your back and the debts you swore could never catch up to you." She paused, allowing the full weight of the revelation to settle on him. A mountain of ruin built by soapsuds and patience. I know you're leveraged 10-to-1 against the bank in Charleston. That money is already moving, not just to buy freedom, but to buy silence. It's securing a route. By tomorrow noon, the financial damage will be registered. By sundown, your creditors will realize this wasn't a robbery. It was a liquidation. And when the sheriff comes calling, he won't find your fortune, but he will find the books, the real books. That detail precisely how much interest you skimmed from the widow Harper's annuity. Sterling dropped to his knees, not in supplication, but because the structure of his reality had given way. The world was upside down. The property had bought the proprietor. They will catch you, he whispered, his eyes wide with desperate malice. They will ride you down, and when they do, I will buy you back just to watch you hang. You cannot escape South Carolina. Clara looked down at him, her expression unchanging, reflecting nothing but the cold logic of her movements. She reached into the pocket of her freshly pressed apron, the uniform of her invisibility, and withdrew a single heavy silver dollar. She tossed it onto the mahogany. You still owe me for the laundry this week, Master Sterling. Consider that payment for services rendered. She didn't wait for his reply. The sound of his defeated sobbing was already fading behind her as she turned and walked without hurry toward the back door of the mansion. The moment she stepped onto the cool, damp earth of the yard, the adrenaline that had been surging through her veins cooled into focused clarity. It was 3:17 a.m. The moon was a sliver of silver hidden behind low clouds. She had exactly 18 minutes before the stable master, habitually an early riser, would begin his rounds. Her escape was not a dash into the wilderness, but a choreographed dance of precise timing and trust. She moved past the empty cotton press, her worn shoes barely stirring the dust. At the edge of the slave quarters, the cluster of cabins where whispers lived and hope often died, a signal was already in place. Hanging from the line among the clean, drying sheets she had washed the day before was a single crimson petticoat, draped just so. The petticoat meant, proceed with extraction plan Alpha. Target neutralized, financial assets secured. She knew eyes were watching, silent as owls. The field hands and house servants had been sleeping lightly for days, alert to the invisible tension that had enveloped the plantation. No one dared to move, but they were breathing her breath, living on the thin edge of her calculated risk. Their silence was her shield. Clara slipped around the back of the smokehouse, waiting in the deep shadows of the massive oak, the same tree where men had been whipped into submission, the same tree where Sterling's father had once broken her own mother, was Elias. Elias was a free man of color from Savannah, running a legitimate freight business that often brought him through the interior counties of South Carolina. He wasn't overtly revolutionary. He was simply good at moving goods, and occasionally people, without attracting notice. He was a master of the mundane. He had been paid well for the last 2 years to transport Clara's accumulated knowledge, papers hidden in double-bottomed barrels of turpentine, savings sewn into the lining of saddles. Clara, are you whole? Elias's voice was a rough whisper, smelling faintly of pipe smoke and damp wool. Whole enough, she replied, reaching into her pocket and handing him a small sealed packet wrapped in oilcloth. This is the final tally, the full manifest, the details of the Charleston line and the contacts we need in Baltimore. It's all there. Elias accepted the packet with the solemnity of receiving a king's ransom. The wagon is ready. North Road. We ride straight past daylight. We, Clara corrected, shaking her head gently. No. You ride, Elias. You take the evidence and the money. If I am caught with you, they catch the whole apparatus. I ride west, then north. The river route. Elias frowned, his face a complex map of anxiety and loyalty. The river route is high water and hell, woman. Nobody runs that way this time of year. It's choked with patrols. That's why I take it, she said, retrieving a worn leather pouch from where it was buried beneath the oak's root. Inside was a small pistol, old, heavy, and meticulously cleaned, and a few dried biscuits. Sterling will report a massive financial loss, not a handful of runaways. They will be looking for a group heavily armed heading directly towards Savannah or Charleston. They will never look for a single woman, dressed as a washerwoman, heading toward the swamplands of the Santee. She stepped back, the darkness swallowing her form. The signal remains the same for the others. If they make it to the ferry crossing, tell them the code is linen is clean. Get the money across the line, Elias. That's the real freight. Before Elias could argue, Clara dissolved into the dense shadow line of the cypress thicket bordering the river. The master strategist had become the single most crucial piece of contraband she had ever manufactured. By 6 a.m., the Sterling plantation was a beehive of violent, directionless activity. Sterling, red-faced and incoherent, was finally pulled from the library by the overseer, who found him weeping over a sheaf of worthless, forged documents. The local sheriff, Jebediah Crow, arrived an hour later, drawn less by the reported crime than by the sheer magnitude of the name involved. Sterling was one of the county's anchors. Sheriff Crow was a big man, slow to anger, but even slower to understand. He surveyed the scene, the overturned safe, the evidence of an intellectual assault rather than a brute force one. The one constant detail Sterling managed to scream over and over was the laundress. A woman! You telling me a woman, one of your own hands, stripped you of $500,000? Crow demanded, chewing tobacco with thoughtful slowness. She knew the market. She knew my schedules. She told me she knew about the widow Harper. Sterling's voice cracked. Crow spat into the dirt. This wasn't a common robbery. Common robberies involved a stolen mule and maybe a silver locket. This involved paper, knowledge, and the systematic destruction of a powerful man's financial empire. It smelled of the North, of abolitionist agitation, even if the weapon had been a local, trusted domestic. She's not just a runaway, Sterling, Crow decided, turning to his deputies. She's a spy, she's an agent. This wasn't about freedom. This was an attack on the whole infrastructure. We look for a network. We look for an armed gang heading north. Start tracking the major roads. Alert the patrols on the Savannah and Augusta lines. I want every single damn checkpoint doubled up. But Crow made a fatal mistake. He looked where the money should have gone. He assumed the conspirators would follow the logic of escape routes toward established havens. He never considered that the laundress, whose entire life had been defined by the meticulous, contrary movement of dirt and water, would choose a route defined by its impossibility. Clara, meanwhile, was sinking deeper into the marshland. The Santee swamp was a brutal, beautiful labyrinth of water moccasins, quicksand, and ancient cypress knees. It was impassable for a mounted man, and deadly for the inexperienced. But Clara wasn't inexperienced. She had spent her childhood Saturdays fishing these very waters when she was deemed too small for the cotton fields. She knew the firm paths from the fatal ones. She knew the resting places of the alligators, and she knew the dense protective canopy that hid smoke signals from the sky. Her destination was a small isolated cabin 20 miles west, owned by a man known only as the Navigator, a half-Cherokee, half-African man who dealt in furs and silence. He was a necessary, dangerous deviation from the main underground railroad track. The journey was a test of endurance. Every mile was paid for in sweat and scraping bark. She walked through the stagnant water, the cold rising above her ankles, slowing her pace but masking her scent from the bloodhounds that she knew would eventually be deployed. She spoke to the swamp, finding comfort in the silence and the familiar, deep-throated calls of the bullfrogs. She wasn't running from Sterling. She was running toward the next phase. The money Elias carried was enough to fund a dozen escapes, but Clara wasn't thinking of a dozen. She was thinking of the 60 souls Sterling had bought from Virginia, the ones who had arrived broken and confused, the ones she had promised to save. 60 people required a dedicated line, multiple safe houses, and an organized resistance force, a task usually handled by large northern societies. Not a single fugitive laundress. When she reached the navigator's cabin after 32 grueling hours, starving and covered in mud, she found the small structure empty, save for a glowing ember in the hearth. A crude drawing was etched into the clay floor, 3 intersecting lines pointing north, with a circle marked P at the end. Philadelphia. The navigator had left her a map, a confirmation, and most importantly, a saddlebag containing dried jerky and a pair of sturdy boots. He knew her mission was larger than personal liberty. The crossing of the Mason-Dixon line 3 weeks later was anticlimactic. It didn't happen in a flurry of gunfire or a dramatic chase. It happened in the back of a refrigerated vegetable cart, under 2 feet of rotting cabbage leaves near a farm in Pennsylvania. Clara emerged into the cold air of a late autumn morning, shivering but alive. The man who pulled her out, a Quaker farmer named William, simply nodded. "Welcome, sister. You are safe here." Clara didn't feel safe. She felt heavy, The freedom was a burden, a responsibility for those still shackled. William drove her directly to the headquarters of the Vigilance Committee in Philadelphia, a bustling, tense center of abolitionist fervor. Here she was reunited with Elias, who had delivered the financial assets successfully. The room was filled with serious men in dark coats and stern women stitching warm quilts for fugitives. They looked at Clara, a small, tired woman in borrowed clothing, and saw a miracle. They saw the end of Sterling, one of the South's most notorious creditors. "Miss Clara," said Mr. Hawthorne, the committee's lead treasurer, adjusting his spectacles, "Elias has delivered the ledgers and the funds. The sum is staggering. After paying off the necessary intermediaries, the pilots, the cartmen, we have a working capital of $53,000, an unprecedented sum." He paused, expecting tears of joy or relief. Clara only looked at the ledger, her brow furrowed. $53,000, she repeated, the numbers rolling off her tongue with the same practiced precision she used for washing formulas. How many souls can that move securely from the Georgia-South Carolina border to Canada? Hawthorne looked taken aback. "Well, with current rates and the need for new routes, we estimate about 40 or 50 if we are extremely careful." Clara tapped the wooden desk with a single, slow finger. Sterling owned 60 new hands, acquired in December, men, women, and 4 children. I promised those 60 that their chains would snap. I need the money to move 60. But Miss Clara, this is the entire treasury of the Vigilance Committee for the next year. This is enough to sustain the Baltimore routes, Hawthorne protested. "Sustaining the route is good," Clara stated, her eyes locking with his. "But opening a new route is better. Sterling is ruined. But the ruin of one man does not dismantle the system. It only sends his property to the next auction block. We must intercept the transport." Her mind was already working the next phase. Sterling's assets, stripped of their paper ownership, would be seized by the courts and sold to cover debts. The 60 slaves would be moved as collateral, most likely shipped down the coast to the deeper, richer plantations of the lower South, where escape was nearly impossible. She knew the timing of the transports. Sterling's meticulous ledgers contained every detail. "I need 3 things from this 53,000, Mr. Hawthorne," Clara continued, leaning forward. "First, I need to buy a small printing press. Second, I need $20,000 to secure the cooperation of Captain Hollis and his sloop. He runs timber from Norfolk to New England. He's greedy, and I know his price. He can move 60 people in one trip, provided the timing is perfect." Hawthorne was aghast. "Hollis is a known scoundrel. He's likely to sell you all to the highest bidder." "Hollis is a man of business," Clara countered calmly. "His price is high because his risk is high. If I pay him more than the price of 60 souls, he becomes my ally. And third, Mr. Hawthorne, I need to know the political temperature in South Carolina right now. Is Sterling trying to hide the scale of his loss? Who is replacing him as the primary creditor?" Clara realized that her escape was merely a transfer of operations. She hadn't traded a life of washing for a life of freedom. She had traded the plantation kitchen for the headquarters of a war. She was no longer a fugitive. She was a financier and a logistical commander. The smile was gone, replaced by the deep, internal calculation of someone who understood that freedom was not given. It was purchased with meticulous planning and the currency of other men's sins. The committee members stared at her. They were used to organizing passive resistance and small, stealthy movements. Clara was talking about a coordinated naval extraction funded by the very men they were fighting. "So you intend to return or at least direct operations near the coast?" Hawthorne asked, voice weak. "I intend to keep my promise," Clara said. "Sterling taught me that the biggest profits come from the biggest risks. $53,000 is not enough for an operation of this scale, but it's enough to buy the tools. And the tools, Mr. Hawthorne, will help me get the rest of the capital I need." She was referring to the list she had secretly compiled over 2 years, the names of other slaveholders in Charleston and Richmond whose financial affairs, like Sterling's, were intricately leveraged and dangerously exposed. She realized she hadn't just ruined Sterling. She had proof that the entire economic edifice of the South was fragile, held together by confidence, not capital. "If you can destroy one, you can destroy 100, she murmured, more to herself than to the committee. "And how do you propose to do that, Miss Clara?" Hawthorne asked, leaning back. resigned to the fact that his quiet Quaker organization was now funded and commanded by a former laundress with the strategic mind of a Wall Street tycoon. Clara smiled then, a small, cold, dangerous gesture that was nothing like the deference she wore on the plantation. "I propose," she said, pulling a list from her oilskin packet, filled with dates and names she had memorized over the years, "to flood the market." The concept was simple, deadly, and entirely unprecedented in the fight for freedom. It was a financial terrorism that utilized paper, not pistols. She would not only fund the escape of the 60, she would ensure that their former value, their worth, was used to collapse the value of all the remaining chattel property in the region, triggering a panic that could starve the slave market into submission. The stakes had risen. Her initial strike was merely the fuse. The explosion was yet to come, and the committee realized with a shared gulp that they were now standing directly beside the powder keg. She didn't just want to save the 60, she wanted to expose the lie that the South was economically viable without its constant supply of human collateral. But first she needed the press and she needed the captain. And the South was already hunting the mastermind behind the greatest theft in its history, not knowing that the mastermind was preparing to steal the entire economic foundation out from under them. Her presence in Philadelphia was temporary. The real work remained below the line. She was moving fast, but the net was closing faster. The authorities were desperate for a culprit, and the reward for the laundress spy was climbing daily. The time for meticulous preparation was over. The time for reckless execution had begun. The relative safety of Philadelphia had quickly curdled into a suffocating cage. The North might offer technical freedom, but true liberty required the dismantling of the Southern engine, and that engine was not housed in any abolitionist meeting hall. It was tucked away in the fireproof vaults of Richmond banks, fueled by the cold, hard calculus of human collateral. Ilara knew the clock was running out the moment she read the notice printed in the Pennsylvania Daily Ledger, a woodcut engraving of a stern, anonymous black woman offering $5,000 for information leading to the capture of the laundress spy. It wasn't the sum that chilled her, but the specificity. They knew she was a woman, and they knew her profession. "Reckless is better than dead," she muttered to Josiah, the young, quiet conductor who managed her return route. Josiah, who had seen enough to know that recklessness often led to death, merely adjusted the collar of his coat, hiding her beneath a stack of burlap sacks on a southbound freight wagon, destination Baltimore. The journey back was a mirror image of her escape, only faster and infinitely more perilous. Going north was seeking light. Going south was plunging back into the black earth. Every mile felt like a tightening of the noose. She was back in Richmond within a week, slipping through the damp, malarial shadows of Shockoe Bottom, the heart of the slave trading district she sought to cripple. The city was different now, not physically. The cobblestone streets, the tobacco warehouses, the oppressive smell of stale river water and fear were the same, but the tension was palpable. The war loomed, a distant but growing storm cloud on the horizon. White men spoke of secession in fervent whispers, while the enslaved community moved with a calculated, heavy silence. Everyone knew the ground was shifting. Ilara didn't return to the laundry. That network was dormant, too hot to touch. She rented a small, dilapidated room above a free black baker in Navy Hill, paying a crippling sum in smuggled northern greenbacks. Her cover was simple, a seamstress, newly arrived from Norfolk, searching for relatives. Her hands, usually stained with indigo and starch, now handled fine needles and thread, weaving tiny, complex patterns into handkerchiefs. But the real pattern she wove was the final strategy. The target was not a person, but a place, the first Richmond deposit and trust. This was where the paper lived, the mortgage notes on the plantations, the bonds based on future cotton yields, and critically, the chattel schedules, the detailed records listing the names, ages, and monetary value of thousands of enslaved people. Destroy the chattel schedules and you didn't free the people instantly, but you rendered their economic value moot, throwing a wrench into the entire surety mechanism of Southern banking. No value on paper meant no collateral, which meant no loans, which meant the war chest of the Confederacy would starve before it ever opened. Ilara knew the trust's layout because she had literally cleaned its inner workings for years. She knew which banker, Mr. Wallace, spilled port wine on his desk every Tuesday night. She knew the sequence of the night watchman's rounds. always pausing precisely 6 minutes by the grandfather clock on the second floor to chew tobacco and lament the declining price of cotton. But the vault itself, housed in the basement, was new. Built 3 years earlier, it was state-of-the-art, a massive iron-reinforced box designed to withstand fire and thieves. The combination was changed weekly and known only to 3 men. This was her primary complication. "You cannot breach the lock, Clara," said Martha, who met her late one night near the city cemetery, under the pretense of leaving flowers. Martha had been risking everything, maintaining the eyes and ears of the network. Her face was drawn, etched with exhaustion. "They keep the cipher written down, yes, but not in the building. It's kept in Master Vance's study safe." The mention of Master Vance, the relentless bounty hunter hired by the Trust to track her, sent a cold shiver down Ilara's spine. Vance was not just shrewd, he was obsessed. He saw her not as property, but as a direct challenge to the Southern institution he held sacred. He was the one who had coined the term laundress spy. "He keeps it in his private study?" Clara asked, her voice low, blending with the cicada chorus. "Yes, a small safe, hidden behind the bookshelf. He trusts no one. He leaves the house every Friday morning at dawn for his private lodge outside Petersburg. He doesn't return until Sunday night." Friday morning. That gave her a precise 48-hour window of opportunity. The window was narrow, but the objective had just doubled. First, Vance's home for the cipher. Second, the trust vault for the schedules. The complexity of the plan escalated wildly. It was no longer a matter of stealth, but of infiltration and exfiltration across 2 high-security locations, separated by miles and by Vance's own security measures. Clara spent the next 3 days acquiring tools, not guns, which were too loud, but precision instruments. Acid to soften iron, a set of slim steel picks painstakingly filed from corset stays, and most crucially, a special, highly flammable oil concocted by a chemist in the free black community, designed to burn intensely hot but dissipate quickly, leaving minimum smoke evidence. She smuggled these items piece by piece, hiding them in the lining of the fancy handkerchiefs she pretended to sew. Thursday night arrived like a massive lead weight. Clara checked her small pack. Her hands, steady as stone, did not betray the internal tremor of fear. Fear was a valuable fuel. It kept you sharp, kept you from making careless mistakes. "May the Lord go with you, child," the baker whispered as she left, pressing a slightly burned biscuit into her hand, a gesture of benediction and farewell. The first move was Vance's estate on the west side of town. It was a stately, arrogant house, walled off from its neighbors by high brick and topped with broken glass. A single aging slave named Silas tended the grounds and the house while Vance was away. Clara had never met Silas, but Martha's network had confirmed his loyalty. A quiet man, but one who knew where all the bodies were buried, literally and figuratively. She approached the house through the tangled wood line, timing her steps to the distant chime of the city clock. Midnight. The guard dog, a massive bloodhound named Brutus, was known for his ferocity. But Brutus also had a weakness: raw liver, laced with enough laudanum to sedate a small pony. Clara tossed the treat over the wall. The ensuing silence after the initial gulp was terrifyingly immediate. Scaling the wall was easy for a woman who had spent a lifetime lifting baskets of wet linen heavier than herself. She dropped silently onto the damp, clipped lawn. Silas met her at the back kitchen door, holding a sputtering whale oil lamp. His face was a mask of exhausted terror and resolve. "You are the one," Silas murmured, his eyes wide. "I am. Is the study clear?" "It is, but hurry, mistress. Vance, he checks in by messenger. He does not truly trust the safe. He only trusts his return." Clara led her to the study, a room heavy with the smell of old paper, cigar smoke and bourbon. The bookshelf was grand, filled with volumes on Roman history and Southern jurisprudence. She located the seam behind the third shelf, exactly as Martha described. The safe was smaller than she anticipated, built by a German craftsman. It wasn't designed to stop a serious assault, only to deter opportunists. Clara worked swiftly, the steel picks dancing in the lock. The quiet clicks were amplified in the heavy silence of the room. A bead of sweat traced a path down her temple. Click, click, click. It took 10 minutes. 10 eternal minutes. The lock sprang open. Inside, nestled beneath a stack of Confederate scrip and a heavily jeweled pistol, was a small leather-bound notebook. Ilara didn't hesitate. She flipped through the pages. Vance had not written the cipher outright. He had created a small, elegant rebus, a picture puzzle combined with names and dates significant to him. The cipher read, "The day the general fell, September 17, plus the age of the old king, 72. The price of my first boy, 800. Ilara's breath hitched, not at the calculation, but at the sheer casual cruelty of the man making a game of human life. The general referred to the Battle of Antietam, September 17, 1862, a Union victory that had shaken the South. The old king was George III. The first boy was a slave Vance had purchased years ago. She did the mental math instantly, 917728000. The final combination was a 6-digit sequence derived from reducing these numbers. She scribbled the final cipher onto the back of the baker's discarded biscuit bag, then carefully replaced the notebook, leaving no trace of her intrusion. "The horse is saddled," Silas whispered, appearing in the doorway. "The bay, fastest one." "Thank you, Silas. May your freedom come soon." "It is coming now, mistress. You brought it with you." She left Vance's estate just before the pre-dawn glow began to lighten the eastern sky. She rode the bay, pushed almost to exhaustion back into the city, leaving it tied 3 blocks from the First Richmond Deposit and Trust. The bank building was a cold monument to Southern financial power, built of granite and impossible stability. Ilara approached the alley entrance, the one used by the laundry carts for 30 years. The door was locked, but the mechanism was old, the hinges often stiff in the morning dew. A small silent application of acid and a well-placed pry bar later, she was inside, moving through the cavernous, echoing ground floor. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper and ink. She moved past the brass cages and mahogany desks, invisible in the darkness, until she reached the back stairwell descending into the basement. Downstairs, the air was cooler, heavy with the smell of damp earth. The vault door loomed, a perfect thick circle of dark metal. She pulled out her instruments and the biscuit bag. The first 3 numbers of the cipher were 319. She set the dial, her ear pressed to the cold steel, listening for the internal thump of the tumblers falling. She was so focused on the mechanics, the silent, intimate conversation with the lock, that she almost missed the sound. It wasn't the slow, rhythmic thump of the watchman upstairs. It was a scraping sound, coming from the top of the stairs she had just descended. Someone was there. Ilara froze, her hands hovering over the dial. She listened, holding her breath until her lungs burned. Silence, perhaps just the wind or a stray rat. She dismissed it, returning to the lock, 319. She moved to the next set of numbers. The scraping sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by a muffled cough. It was human, and it was coming down the steps. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She pressed the dial hard against her ear, forcing herself back into the lock, ignoring the encroaching threat. She had to finish. If she ran now, the entire plan, the entire 2 years of preparation, was lost. The second set of numbers, 642. She heard a footstep hit the basement floor. Heavy. Not the watchman. The watchman wore soft shoes. This was a man in boots. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. She recognized the weight of the step. It was Agent Vance. He hadn't gone to Petersburg. He had laid a trap, anticipating her desperate return. He knew her obsession with the financial core of the city. He had only needed to wait. "Don't bother with the last dial, laundress," Vance's voice echoed in the cavernous room, dry and cold as dust. "It's a magnificent safe. Pity you won't live to see the inside." Ilara did not move. She did not turn around. She was now completely exposed, illuminated by the single pale beam of her own small lantern set on the floor. "I confess you had me puzzled for a time," Vance continued, approaching slowly, the sound of his heavy boots crunching on stray grit. "The network, the ciphers, brilliant. You almost made me believe there was a conspiracy of free men behind it. But no, just a highly motivated washerwoman. It's almost laughable." He stopped 10 feet behind her. Ilara could feel the heat radiating off his body, the heavy leather of his coat, the cold steel of the weapon she knew was leveled at her back. "Turn around slowly, Ilara. The reward is substantial. But I intend to take you alive so the trust can question your little network. Your ledger will be the last thing you see." The last number of the cipher was 0. Ilara's fingers, steady despite the certainty of death, turned the dial to 0. Click, thump, click. The tumblers aligned with an authoritative final sound. The internal mechanisms of the safe shifted, the massive bolts retracting with a deep, grinding groan. The door was unlocked. Vance gasped, a sound of genuine surprise and fury. He hadn't expected her to continue the work, even facing his gun. "You stubborn fool!" he roared, taking a step forward. This was Ilara's moment. She had prepared for this confrontation, though she never expected it to be so immediate and personal. Before Vance could close the distance, Ilara lunged, not at him, but at the lantern. She swept it off the ground, twisting her body away from the safe door, and threw the light source with all her strength against the nearest granite wall. The fragile glass shattered violently. The whale oil splattered everywhere, engulfing the small pile of old dry burlap sacks used for cleaning rags stacked nearby. Instantly, she uncorked the vial of special oil she had prepared and flung it into the resulting fire. The effect was instantaneous and shocking. Instead of a flickering flame, a roaring white-hot blaze erupted, fueled by the accelerating combustion agent. The intense heat drove the air out of the basement. Vance bellowed in shock, stumbling back from the sudden, blinding heat and light. He fired his pistol blindly, the bullet whining harmlessly off the granite floor near Ilara's feet. Ilara was already through the heavy vault door, which she slammed shut behind her, twisting the external locking handle with one quick, desperate motion. The sound of the heavy, reinforced iron door closing was the sound of her own temporary salvation. The heavy latch clicked into place, plunging the interior of the vault into absolute darkness. Vance, trapped outside in the rapidly escalating inferno, began to kick furiously at the door, screaming threats and demanding to be let in. "You cannot escape fire in a vault, laundress. You will suffocate before you burn." Ilara ignored him. Suffocation was a clean death. Her mission, however, was not complete. She lit a small protected match, the smell of sulfur acrid in the enclosed space. The vault was a veritable treasure chest of the Confederacy's financial secrets. She found the shelves marked Mortgage Schedules, 1860-1863. The schedules were massive, leather-bound books, dense with tiny, precise script listing names like inventory. She pulled down the first ledger, throwing it onto the stone floor. She pulled down the second, the third, the 10th. She did not weep. She did not hesitate. Her movements were precise, professional. These ledgers were the chains that bound millions. Destroying them was an act of liberation, not vandalism. Outside, Vance's desperate battering on the iron door was growing weaker, the screaming muffled by the thick metal. The fire, fueled by the special oil, was consuming the entire hallway, the heat radiating through the thick metal door like an oven. Ilara doused the stacks of paper with the remaining flammable oil. She held the last match, watching the small flame dance in the suffocating air, a tiny star in the oppressive darkness. Before striking the match, she paused, opening the first ledger to a random page. A name stared back at her. Amina, 42, excellent weaver, value 1,200. A person reduced to a number, an asset. "No more schedules," Ilara whispered, striking the match against the stone floor. The blaze ignited instantly, transforming the vault into a scorching, flickering hellscape. The smell of burning paper, leather, and years of economic documentation was overpowering. Ilara backed into the far corner, pulling a pre-soaked linen mask over her face, her final necessary preparation. She knew she couldn't stay. She was protected from the intense flames by the vault's design, but not from the carbon monoxide that would soon fill the room. The irony of her situation was not lost on her. The thing designed to preserve the economic order of the South, the fireproof vault, was now the mechanism of its temporary destruction, trapping her inside with the evidence. Outside, the desperate battering had stopped. There was only the roar of the fire and the crackle of burning wood as the blaze began to consume the structure above. Ilara reached into her pack and pulled out her final tool, a small but powerful drill she had modified. It was designed to slowly cut a clean circle through the vault door, just large enough for a person to wriggle through, a necessary failsafe. But she couldn't use the door she had locked. Vance's body was likely just outside, or the heat too intense. She turned her attention to the back wall. She had previously identified a weak point, a seam where the modern vault connected to an older, rarely used subterranean cellar beneath the bank annex. The drilling would be loud, agonizingly slow, and expose her to even more danger. But it was the only way out. Ilara pressed the tip of the drill against the cold, damp stone and steel of the wall and began to work. The screeching noise filled the vault, a mechanical howl over the roar of the fire. Minutes stretched into eternity. The vault grew hotter, the air thinner, heavy with the smell of smoke escaping the burning paper. Ilara focused solely on the point of the drill, watching the thin stream of pulverized stone and metal dust fall away. After what felt like hours, the drill finally broke through the outer layer of stone, hitting the softer earth of the sub-cellar beyond. A tiny breath of fresh, cool air streamed through the hole, not enough to save her, but a promise of freedom. She quickly widened the hole, utilizing the last of her strength. Her arms ached, her lungs protested, and the light from the burning ledges cast dancing, terrible shadows on her sweat-streaked face. Finally, the opening was large enough. She threw her body through the opening, rolling onto the damp, root-tangled floor of the old cellar. The fire's roar, which had been deafening, was immediately muffled behind the thick stone. She lay there for a moment, gasping, letting the cool, stale air flood her lungs. She had done it. The chattel schedules were burning, the foundation of the trust compromised. The laundress spy had delivered the ultimate blow, but she was still deep beneath the heart of Richmond, covered in soot and sweat, emerging into a burning building, with Agent Vance's fate unknown, and the entire city about to erupt into chaos once the flames were discovered. Ilara knew the time of reckoning was far from over. It was only just beginning. She had traded her meticulously prepared safety for an immediate, desperate flight. Now she had to ensure the impact of the burning ledgers was not just symbolic, but systemic. She had to escape Richmond, and she had to spread the word that the numbers no longer mattered. She rose, brushing dirt and ash from her clothes, and began navigating the maze of dark tunnels beneath the First Richmond Deposit and Trust, heading toward the only destination left, the James River, and the hope of vanishing without a trace. The city was silent, but only for now. Soon the alarms would sound, and the hunt would resume with a vengeance that transcended mere dollars. She was now the most wanted woman in the Confederacy. The air in the subterranean passage was thick with the scent of wet mortar, stagnant river sludge, and the faint metallic tang of old iron. Ilara moved with the economy of a hunted creature, her bare feet silent on the uneven stone floor. She clutched the canvas sack containing the ledgers and the smaller bag of gold with a grip that turned her knuckles white. The cold of the bank vault had been a physical shock. The cold of these tunnels, a psychological suffocation. Every echo was a potential pursuer. The map, seared into her memory over years of painstaking observation and whispers from the old railroad workers, guided her through the labyrinth. These tunnels were the hidden arteries of old Richmond, used long ago for illicit liquor, and now providing a desperate path to freedom. She knew the network branched out everywhere, but her focus was singular: the main drainage line that fed into the James River, a short mile-and-a-half downriver from the main docks. She had only moved a few hundred yards, the silence pressing down on her like a physical weight, when the city above finally screamed. It wasn't a human scream, but the cacophony of urgency, the insistent, panicked ringing of the alarm bells at the First Richmond Deposit and Trust. The sound was thin and distant at first, muted by the earth, but quickly grew into a shrill, piercing shriek that bounced off the tunnel walls. It was a sound that told the entire sleeping city that something fundamental had been violated: Thorne's body. They found him quicker than she expected, or perhaps the combination to the main vault had been attempted, triggering an automatic silent alarm first. It didn't matter. The clock, which had been ticking slow for years, was now wound tight. Ilara paused in a shallow alcove, the tunnel narrowing here. She pulled the last of the lantern oil from her pocket, enough for a small, controlled burn, not light. She needed smoke, not illumination. Above, the city was erupting. She heard the distant, muffled shouts of patrols, the thudding gallop of horses on cobblestones. This wasn't the slow, meandering search for a runaway slave. This was the feverish pursuit of an enemy who had attacked the very foundation of Confederate wealth. The news would spread like wildfire. Not only had a vast sum of gold vanished, but the ledgers, the cold, hard accounting of who owned whom, and the true value of the human collateral were gone. The loss of the names, the proof, was arguably more damaging than the loss of the currency. It was an attack on ownership itself. She started moving again, faster now, knowing that within the hour every exit grate and storm drain leading to the James River would be guarded by men hell-bent on capturing her, dead or alive. She came to the confluence of the two main drainage pipes. Here, the water was shin-deep and ice-cold, smelling sharply of sulfur and iron. The air was marginally cleaner, indicating the river was close. She stopped only long enough to smear the damp mud across the white cuffs of the banker's trousers she wore, disguising the only parts of the garment that would betray her origin. Elias. He had to be there. Their agreement had been years in the making, dependent on timing and fate. Elias, the ferryman who worked the low-tide routes, had promised her a boat and passage upriver toward the relative chaos of the contested territories near Petersburg. The last stretch of the tunnel was a muddy, exhausting crawl. The ceiling lowered until she had to move on hands and knees, dragging the sacks beside her. The sounds of the city faded, replaced by the steady rush of the river ahead, a powerful, calming roar. Finally, she reached the iron grate. It was heavy, rusting, and secured by 3 thick, ancient bolts. She had anticipated this. She set down the sacks, pulled out the simple, strong tool Elias had given her, a steel pry bar disguised as a length of broken fence post, and began the agonizing work. The first bolt screamed in protest, a sound swallowed immediately by the river noise. The second was looser. As she strained against the third, she heard something else, a different kind of sound, not the city, but the immediate vicinity. Footsteps, heavy boots on the dock planks directly above the grate. Ilara froze, the pry bar held mid-twist. She could hear the distinct sound of 2 men arguing in hushed, urgent tones. They were searching the riverbank, likely checking the exact drain outlet she needed to use. "I tell you, Major, ain't nothing but rats down there. That bank job was done by professionals, not some raggedy field hand." "Shut your mouth, Dobbs. Captain Hollis said to check every hole large enough for a body to crawl through. They stole enough money to buy half the goddamn county. We find them, we get a fat bounty." Ilara's mind raced. If she moved, the metal would scrape against the stone. If she waited, they would surely check the grate next. She had minutes, perhaps seconds, before they decided to lift the heavy iron cover. She carefully lowered the pry bar, retrieved the small bottle of oil, and poured its contents onto a length of dry jute rope she carried, stuffing the end into the narrow gap where the last bolt was stuck. She struck a match, the single, fragile spark of light illuminating the desperation in her eyes, and lit the fuse. The flame caught, hissing softly. She grabbed the pry bar and applied all her weight to the third bolt, ignoring the proximity of the heat. "Screech!" The men above stopped talking. "Did you hear that?" Dobbs whispered. Ilara didn't wait. The bolt finally gave, spinning loose. With a burst of adrenaline, she jammed the pry bar under the heavy grate and heaved. The iron resisted, but the rusting hinges complained, and with a guttural groan, the grate lifted just enough for her to squeeze through. As she slipped out, the burning rope ignited the oily rags she had pre-placed just inside the tunnel mouth. A thick, noxious plume of black smoke instantly billowed from the grate, rushing up toward the dock. "Fire!" shouted Dobbs. "They're down there! They're burning something!" Ilara rolled onto the damp gravel, clutching her sacks. She was shielded from the immediate view of the men by a stack of decaying lumber, but they were closing fast. She heard a flurry of movement and the click-clack of muskets being leveled. She was exposed 50 yards from the river's edge. "Hold your fire! Don't let them get to the water!" She didn't run, she sprinted low to the ground, propelled by years of suppressed fury and training. She heard the roar of the river, and then a quieter, more welcome sound. A low, resonant whistle, the call of the night ferryman. "Elias!" she hissed. A dark shape detached itself from the permanent fog clinging to the James River, a flat-bottomed boat, heavily laden, moving silently against the gentle current. Elias, a mountain of a man with skin the color of river clay, stood in the bow, his eyes fixed on the shore. "Hurry, woman! They're on you like buzzards on a gut pile!" Elias called, his voice barely audible over the rush of the water. The soldiers had reached the burning grate. They realized they were too late to enter the tunnels, but could still cut her off. "There! By the lumber pile!" one of them yelled. A rifle cracked. The ball struck the ground beside her, spitting gravel and mud into her face. She stumbled but kept moving. The edge of the dock was slick with algae. Ilara reached the narrow gangplank Elias had extended. She threw the heavier sack containing the ledgers first, watching it land with a dull thud in the bilge water. Then the gold. "Jump!" Elias roared. She leapt, landing hard on the damp planks of the boat, just as the soldiers reached the edge of the embankment. "Stop right there or we shoot." Ilara did not stop. She scrambled toward Elias, who was already pushing off with a long, heavy pole, thrusting the boat out into the swift-moving main channel of the James. "They're too far," Elias muttered, his powerful muscles straining against the current. "They can't get a clear shot." "They will find a skiff. They will follow," Ilara said, her breath ragged. She pulled a length of hemp rope from under the deck, their final contingency. "We ain't got time to row to Petersburg, Elias. We need distance fast," she pressed. Elias glanced back at the shore. The soldiers were shouting orders, their forms illuminated by the growing glow of the burning rags at the tunnel mouth. "I got something for 'em," Elias said, a grim smile splitting his face. He pulled a thick, tightly wrapped bundle from beneath a coil of rope, a bundle of the same specialized lamp oil she had used earlier, mixed with pitch and rags, an impromptu torch. "The ferry dock, Elias, not us." Elias nodded, understanding the sheer audacity of the plan. She wasn't trying to run. She was severing Richmond's access to the river in the immediate vicinity. He swung the boat wide, bringing them close to the old, neglected public ferry dock, a long, rickety structure of dried pine and heavy oil residue, currently tied up with a small cluster of governmental skiffs. As they skimmed past the dock pilings, Elias expertly lit the bundle and hurled it with terrifying force. It landed squarely on the deck of the nearest government skiff, shattering the container and spreading the volatile oil over the dry wood. In seconds, the night was split by a sudden intense burst of orange flame. The dry pine caught instantly, fire licking hungrily up the pilings and across the main deck of the ferry dock. The soldiers on the bank roared in shock and fury. The fire was spreading too rapidly to fight immediately, especially with no water source close by. It was a chaotic, brilliant, and devastating diversion. They were trapped on the riverbank, while the object of their rage drifted silently into the main channel. Ilara lay back against the coarse planks, the heat of the fire washing over her face. She wasn't safe yet, not by a long shot, but she had bought them precious hours. The flickering light of the burning dock cast long dancing shadows on the fast-moving water. "You set the whole damn river on fire," Elias said, awe mixed with fear in his voice. "It will slow them down," Ilara whispered, finally allowing herself a single shaky breath. "They won't get a boat across the river before dawn." Elias began rowing in earnest, using the darkness and the river fog as their allies, aiming for a small forgotten inlet 30 miles north, a place where the underground railroad lines were still active and less patrolled than the major river ports. The journey upriver was grueling. They were fighting the current, and every muscle in Ilara's body screamed in protest. The adrenaline from the bank robbery was fading, replaced by the profound ache of exhaustion and the heavy weight of her decisions. Elias kept up a steady pace, talking softly to the river, muttering old prayers that smelled of deep swamp and ancient resilience. "They're gonna hunt you to the ends of the earth, Ilara," he said finally, his eyes fixed on the black water. "Not for the gold, though that's enough, but for the paperwork. You stole their ledger, girl. You stole the proof they were just men who owned nothing but the idea of owning others." Ilara pulled the canvas sack closer. "They can't burn what they can't find. This proof goes north, Elias, to the people who can use it." She wasn't naive. She knew what she had done. Killing Thorne, an agent of the Confederacy, guaranteed her status as an enemy combatant, not just a runaway. There would be no mercy if she were caught. She had crossed a line few dared to cross. She had retaliated not with violence born of rage, but with violence executed by calculation. As dawn broke, thin and grey over the tree line, they pulled the boat into a thicket of cypress and Spanish moss. The location was perfect. Shallow water hidden from the main channel and accessible only by a single, nearly invisible path winding through the marsh. Elias secured the boat. "Wait here. I'll bring the contact by high noon." "No, Elias. I go now." Ilara was firm. "I cannot stay still, and the ledgers must move immediately." She opened the sack. The financial records were wrapped tightly in oiled cloth, preserving them from the damp. She counted the gold, a significant, life-changing amount, but a pittance compared to the millions she had left burning in the vault, a necessary sacrifice to ensure the fire didn't spread too fast and destroy the ledgers. She divided the gold. "This is yours, Elias. And this," she handed him a small sealed packet, "is for the network. They will need it more than I will for the ones coming behind me." Elias hesitated, looking at the generous share of gold. "You took too many risks for me to get rich, Elara." "I took risks for freedom, Elias. Wealth is just the lockpick." She took her own share, tucking it into the deep pockets sewn into the lining of her heavy coat, a coat that now felt like a second skin, woven with purpose and the ghosts of her past. She then pulled out the final item she had stolen from Thorne's office, a small, unassuming black notebook. This was not the bank ledger. This was Thorne's personal journal of contacts and informants, names she recognized, names she despised. "One last thing, Elias, before I vanish." She stood on the muddy bank, the cool river water washing over her stolen banker's shoes. She opened the notebook to the first page, memorizing the address of a senator in South Carolina who had betrayed the Underground Railroad network 3 years prior, leading to the capture of an entire family. "This man, Senator Beaumont," Elara said, pointing to the name. "He needs to know that his secrets are no longer safe, that the price of betrayal has increased. And how will you tell him, Elara? You're heading north." "Not me. The Weaver." She smiled, a cold, terrifying sight that held no humor. She handed Elias a letter, sealed with the bank's wax, addressed to the senator. "Have this delivered, tomorrow, by an anonymous runner. Let the Weaver become a whisper, Elias, a ghost with knowledge." She wasn't just escaping. She was establishing a new identity, a terror, an economic threat, an intelligence agent operating with impunity within the highest echelons of the Confederacy. The gold was finite. The fear she generated was eternal. Elara embraced Elias quickly, a silent promise of loyalty passing between them. "May God speed you, Elara," Elias murmured. "God had nothing to do with this," she corrected him softly. "This was all human calculation." She turned and stepped onto the damp, hidden path, the moss heavy and silent. She moved quickly, abandoning the heavy banker's coat as she entered the dense woods, trading the disguise of wealth for the camouflage of wilderness. For the next week, she walked north, surviving on the scant provisions Elias had provided and her own ingrained knowledge of the land. She passed through small towns, always keeping to the edges of civilization, relying on the cover of night and the constant chatter of the forests. The fear followed her like a shadow, not the fear of capture, but the fear of resting, of stopping the relentless momentum she had built. When she finally reached the designated point, a dilapidated tobacco farm on the border of Virginia and Pennsylvania, run by a Quaker contact, she was half-starved, exhausted, but completely free. The Quaker, an older woman named Martha, received her without a single question, tending to her wounds and feeding her broth. Elara spoke only once that first day, delivering the heavy ledgers. "These are for the Union intelligence," Elara stated simply. "They detail every transaction, every bond, every life calculated as collateral in Richmond since 1855. It is their internal map." Martha's eyes widened, recognizing the monumental nature of the transfer. "This is evidence, child. This will turn tides." "It is leverage," Elara corrected. "Leverage to prove that this war is not just about ideals, but about cash flow and accountability." The impact of the Richmond affair was slow, insidious, and devastating. Within days, the news spread throughout the Confederacy, carefully managed and heavily censored. The bank had been robbed, the gold gone. But the true destabilizing effect was the panic in the elite circles. Senator Beaumont received his letter. It contained specific details about his personal debts, his mistress, and the date he had accepted a bribe to reveal the railroad route. The senator, gripped by sudden, paralyzing fear that his entire network of corruption was exposed, suffered a stroke and died within the week. His death was officially listed as a consequence of apoplexy, but in the darkened backrooms of Richmond, the whispers started. The Weaver. The Weaver knew the numbers. The Weaver knew the secrets. The Weaver had not only stolen money, she had stolen confidence. The public perception of the bank robbery focused on the money, leading to a massive, embarrassing investigation that implicated several prominent bank managers. Convenient scapegoats, of course. But the information in the ledgers, once verified by Union intelligence, became a devastating weapon. It revealed the Confederate internal bond structure, key investment points, and the financial weakness of several key supply operations. Ilara, having delivered the materials, did not wait for praise or recognition. She took her small cache of gold and continued north, crossing into Philadelphia, a free woman, unmarked by the slave catchers, a ghost who had walked out of the system. She found work immediately, not as a domestic or a seamstress, but using the very skills that had saved her life: accounting and strategic finance. She opened a small, legitimate, but highly specialized financial consulting service, catering primarily to the burgeoning free black community and the abolitionist groups. She never used the name Ilara again. She went by Mrs. Eleanor Vane, a widow from Charleston, who knew how to read books, balance ledgers, and secure futures. She built her new life meticulously, brick by calculated brick. She understood that true freedom wasn't just physical distance, it was economic independence and the power to control information. She used her capital to buy property, always ensuring her deeds were clear, her taxes paid, and her records immaculate. She did not seek revenge. She sought power, the kind that came from impeccable financial security. Years passed. The war ground to its brutal, inevitable conclusion. When news of the Emancipation Proclamation reached Philadelphia, Mrs. Vane was sitting in her office reviewing quarterly statements. She felt no immediate, overwhelming joy, only a deep, quiet recognition that the numbers finally had shifted. The stories of the Richmond bank job faded into wartime legend, a sophisticated, impossible heist attributed to northern spies or rogue elements. But sometimes late at night, a freedman or woman passing through Philadelphia who had been part of the system would look at Mrs. Vane, observe the stillness in her hands, the cool calculation in her dark eyes, and recognize something familiar. They recognized the architect of impossible things. Mrs. Vane lived long, prosperous, and entirely free. She never married, devoting her life instead to building the infrastructure for those who followed her path, funding schools, purchasing land for new communities, and financing operations to secure remaining families still trapped in the South. She never spoke of the night in Richmond, never claimed credit for the shattered confidence she had inflicted upon the Confederacy. Her triumph was a personal ledger, balanced with cold precision: life for life, dollar for dollar, freedom for the unbearable price of the past. She retired in 1905, a wealthy, respected, and deeply enigmatic figure in Philadelphia society. Her legacy was not defined by the money she had stolen, but by the certainty she had created. The knowledge that no institution, no system of oppression was too vast or too secure to be dismantled by one focused, invisible mind. She died peacefully in her sleep, leaving behind a complex, flawless will that distributed her fortune entirely to educational endowments for formerly enslaved people. Her personal effects were sparse. Among them, a small black iron key, not the ornate modern key to the bank vault, but the heavy, crude key to the lockbox, where Master Thorne had kept the register of her mother's sale. That was the only thing she truly kept from the old world. The key held no value to the executors. It was simply a relic. But to Mrs. Vane, it had always been the symbol of her quiet contract with history. She had spent a lifetime proving that the value assigned to her by men who wrote ledgers could always be recalculated. She had rewritten the numbers, one life, one risk, one impossible triumph at a time. The world thought she was a respectable widow. She knew she was the shadow that broke the bank.